Listen to a conversation between a student and his sociology professor.
Well, I'm glad you redid your outline. I've made a few comments, but nothing you have to act on. It's in good enough shape for you to start writing your paper.
Thanks. At first I was afraid all that prep work would be a waste of time.
Well, especially with a challenging topic like yours, factors leading to the emergence of sociology as an academic discipline. There's just so much history to consider, you could get lost without a solid outline. So, did you have a question?
Yeah, it's about... You mentioned needing volunteers for a research study?
Yep. It's not my study, it's my colleagues in the marketing department. She needs people to watch various new TV programs that haven't been broadcast yet. Then indicate on a survey whether they liked it, why, if they'd watch another episode. It'd be kind of fun. Plus, participants get a $50 gift certificate.
Oh, well, I like the sound of that. But, so they're trying to predict if these shows are going to succeed or fail, right? Based on students' opinions? Why would they care what we think?
Hey, don't sell yourself short. People your age are a very attractive market for advertisers who promote their products on television. The study's sponsored by a TV network. If enough students don't like a show, the network may actually reconsider putting it on the air.
Okay, well, how do I sign up?
You just add your name and phone number to this list and check a time slot. Although it looks like the only times left are next Monday morning and Thursday evening.
Oh, well, I have marketing and economics Monday mornings and Thursday.
Oh, you're taking a marketing class? Who's teaching it?
It's Professor Larkin, Intro to Marketing. He hasn't mentioned the study, though.
Oh, well, the marketing department's pretty big. I happen to be friends with the woman who's doing the TV study. Okay, well, we don't want you missing class. How's Thursday?
Oh, I work from 5 till 9 that night.
No flexibility with your schedule? Where do you work?
At Fox's Diner. I'm a server.
Oh, I love Fox's. I eat there every week. Maybe you could switch shifts with someone.
I'm still in training, and the only night my trainer works is Thursday.
Look, I know the owners there really well. Why don't you let me give them a call and explain the situation?
Okay. It'd be cool to be part of a real research study, and the gift certificate wouldn't hurt either.
Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
Oh, you're taking a marketing class? Who's teaching it?
It's Professor Larkin, Intro to Marketing. He hasn't mentioned the study, though.
Oh, well, the marketing department's pretty big. I happen to be friends with the woman who's doing the TV study.
What does the professor mean when she says this?
Oh, well, the marketing department's pretty big.
Listen to part of a lecture in a European history class.
In order to really study the social history of the Middle Ages, you have to understand the role of spices. Now, this might sound a little surprising, even a little strange, but what seem like little things now were back then actually rather big things. So, first let's define what a spice is. Technically speaking, a spice is part of an aromatic plant that is not a leaf or herb. Spices can come from tree bark, like cinnamon, plant roots, like ginger, flower buds, like cloves. And in the Middle Ages, Europeans were familiar with lots of different spices, the most important being pepper, cloves, ginger, cinnamon, mace, and nutmeg. These spices literally dominated the way Europeans lived for centuries, how they traded, and even how they used their imaginations. So why this medieval fascination with spices? We can boil it down to 3 general ideas, briefly. 1 was cost and rarity. 2 was exotic taste and fragrance. And 3rd, mysterious origins and kind of mythical status. Now, for cost and rarity. Spices aren't native to Europe, and they had to be imported. Spices only grew in the East Indies, and, of course, transportation costs were astronomical. So spices were incredibly valuable, even from the very beginning. Here's an example. In 408 AD, the Gothic general who'd captured Rome demanded payment. He wanted 5,000 pounds of gold, among other things, but he also wanted 3,000 pounds of pepper. Now, maybe that'll give you an idea of exactly where pepper stood at the time. By the Middle Ages, spices were regarded as so important and expensive, they were used in diplomacy. as gifts by heads of state and ambassadors. Now, for the taste. The diet then was relatively bland compared to today's. There wasn't much variety, especially the aristocracy, who tended to eat a lot of meat. They were always looking for new ways to prepare it, new sauces, new tastes, and this is where spices came in. Now, this is a good point to mention one of the biggest myths about spices. It's commonly said that medieval Europeans wanted spices to cover up the taste of spoiled meat, but this isn't really true. Anyone who had to worry about spoiled meat couldn't afford spices in the first place. If you could afford spices, you could definitely afford fresh meat. We also have evidence that various medieval markets employed a kind of police to make sure that people didn't sell spoiled food. And if you were caught doing it, you were subject to various fines, humiliating public punishments. So what actually was true was this. In order to have meat for the winter, people would preserve it in salt, not a spice. Spices actually aren't very effective as preservatives. And throughout winter, they would eat salted meat. But the taste of the stuff could grow really boring and depressing after a while. So the cooks started looking for new ways to improve the taste, and spices were the answer. Which brings us to mysterious origins and mythical status. Now, the ancient Romans had a thriving spice trade, and they sent their ships to the east and back. But when Rome collapsed in the 5th century and the Middle Ages began, direct trade stopped. And so did that kind of hands-on knowledge of travel and geography. Spices now came by way of the trade routes, with lots of intermediaries between the producer and the consumer. So these spices took on an air of mystery. Their origins were shrouded in exotic travels. They had the allure of the unknown, of wild places. Myths grew up of fantasy lands, magical, faraway places made entirely of food and spices. Add to that, spices themselves had always been considered special or magical, not just for eating, and this was already true in the ancient world where legends about spices were abundant. Spices inspired the medieval imagination. They were used as medicines to ward off diseases and mixed into perfumes, incense. They were used in religious rituals for thousands of years. They took on a life of their own, and they inspired the medieval imagination, spurred on the Age of Discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries, when famous explorers like Columbus and da Gama and Magellan left Europe in their ships. They weren't looking for a new world. They were looking for spices. And we know what important historical repercussions some of those voyages had.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Here's an example. In 408 AD, the Gothic general who'd captured Rome demanded payment. He wanted 5,000 pounds of gold, among other things, but he also wanted 3,000 pounds of pepper. And maybe that'll give you an idea of exactly where pepper stood at the time.
Why does the professor say this?
And maybe that'll give you an idea of exactly where pepper stood at the time.
Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
Well, it's finally looking like spring is arriving. The last of the winter snow will be melting away in a few days. So before we close today, I thought I'd mention a biological event that's part of the transition from winter to spring. Something you can go outside and watch, if you have some patience. There's a small creature that lives in this area. You've probably seen it. It's the North American wood frog. Now, the wood frog's not that easy to spot since it stays pretty close to the ground, under leaves and things, and it blends in really well with its background, as you can see. But they're worth the effort because they do something very unusual, something you might not have even thought possible. Okay, North American wood frogs live over a very broad territory, or range. They're found all over the northeastern United States and all through Canada and Alaska, even inside the Arctic Circle. No other frog is able to live that far north. But wherever they live, once the weather starts to turn cold and the temperatures start to drop below freezing, as soon as the frog even touches an ice crystal or a bit of frozen ground, well, it begins to freeze. Yes, Jimmy, you look a little bit taken aback.
Wait, you mean it's still alive, but it freezes? Solid?
Well, almost. Ice forms in all the spaces outside cells, but never within a cell.
But then how does its heart beat?
It doesn't.
But how could it
How can it do such a thing? Well, that first touch of ice apparently triggers a biological response inside the frog that first of all starts drawing water away from the center of its body. So the middle part of the frog, its internal organs, its heart, lungs, liver, these start getting drier and drier, while the water that's being pulled away is forming a puddle around the organs just underneath the skin. And then that puddle of water starts to freeze. Okay, up to now, the frog's heart is still beating, right? Slower and slower, and in those last few hours before it freezes, it distributes glucose, a blood sugar, throughout its body, its circulatory system. Sort of acts like an antifreeze.
A solution of antifreeze, like you put in your car in the winter?
Well, you tell me. In frogs, the extra glucose makes it harder for the water inside the cells to freeze. So the cells stay just slightly wet, enough so that they can survive the winter. Then, after that, the heart stops beating altogether. So, is that the same?
I don't really know, but how long does it stay that way?
Well, it could be days or even months. All winter, in fact. But, see, the heart really doesn't need to do any pumping now because the blood is frozen too.
I guess I just don't see how it isn't, clinically dead.
Well, that's the amazing thing. And how it revives is pretty amazing too. After months without a heartbeat, springtime comes around again, the earth starts to warm up, and suddenly, one day, ping, a pulse, followed by another one, then another, until maybe 10, 12 hours later, the animal is fully recovered.
And does the thawing process have some kind of trigger as well?
Well, we're not sure, actually. The peculiar thing is even though the sun is warming the frog up on the outside, its insides thaw out first, the heart and brain and everything. But somehow it all just happens that way every spring.
And after they thaw, does it affect them, like their lifespan?
Well, we really don't know a lot about how long a wood frog normally lives, probably just a few years. But there's no evidence that the freezing process affects its longevity. It does have some other impacts, though. In studies, we found that when it comes to reproduction, freezing diminishes the mating performance of males. After they've been frozen, and thawed, of course, they don't seem quite as vocal. They move slower, and they seem to have a harder time recognizing a potential mate. So, if a male frog could manage not to go through this freezing cycle, he'd probably have more success in mating.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
A solution of antifreeze, like you put in your car in the winter?
Well, you tell me. In frogs, the extra glucose makes it harder for the water inside the cells to freeze. So the cells stay just slightly wet, enough so that they can survive the winter. Then, after that, the heart stops beating altogether. So, is that the same?
What does the professor imply when she says this?
Well, you tell me.